Thank you. Today's session is the introduction to other OSs. Over, over the last 10 years, the popularity of newer OSs has increased. In this session, we're going to come into contact with both Linux and your Mac OS. Linux is typically used more often in part because of its proprietary OS systems that is inside on the given devices like your access points, your actual firewalls, routers, um, you name it. There's a whole bunch of security systems out there that are based out of this actual system. If you ever gone onto a Cisco switch and you go into the actual prompt, you would see that it's very familiar to an actual Linux prompt. The best be able to serve our diverse groups, specifically our Mac OS users, are one of the ones that are coming out here when we're calling and looking for fixing these designer machines and high-end machines where they're obviously dealing with graphics. Usually those are out there. Linux ones are out, as we said, for those routers, firewalls, switches, and a plethora of other devices that are configured with this. By the end of this session, we want to be able to explain the overall purpose and context of navigating these given OSs. Now we're talking about within the Mac OS and the actual shell that it has available for you. As for Linux, a lot of them do not come with anything except for the terminal, and you need to choose what type of shell. Some of them already come with the actual shell GUI out, so that you could be able to actually navigate the system like the Windows Explorer. We need to be able to, lastly, compare and contrast the features and functionalities within the given OSs, be it Mac OS or the Linux OS. As you'll see also in this section, we're only going to be covering the basic commands and or what is, I would say, repetitive in all the flavors of Linux and very common to be used within all of them. I would say it's the base of Unix or the commands that's also available within Unix. Correct statement there, Laz?
Oh yeah, big time.
So overall, the key growth in popularity of both Linux and the Mac OS, as I said, has increased, and it is important for us as computer technicians to be fully aware of this and adapt and be able to have a growth mindset, put on our hats, specifically when it comes to Linux as it continues to grow. Mac OS continues to change, just like we have the actual Windows OS who continues to change. And obviously now they said supposedly they're just gonna have Windows 10 and that's it, but they're gonna have upgrades. But it's gonna be called Windows 10. Yeah. Overall, just like any other OS, we need and within the Mac OS, Linux OSs, we need to function and make sure we maintain so to it can continue to function. One of the best practice, as always, is have backups. Scheduled backups will be preferred. Disk maintenance, updates on the actual system, be within the app store itself or the actual patch management. You have your driver and firmware updates, which do not change, obviously. Your anti-malware updates. You have, in this case, I believe in the Mac OS is called Time Machine for backups. You still have your snapshots, but here it's not called restore, it's called snapshots. You have your image recoveries themselves, disk maintenance utilities. You still have your shell and your actual terminal to be able to give the commands, which is usually where you want to be within Linux. That is where you want to concentrate yourself because of the fact that it is unique. Every given Linux, its actual GUI or Windows Explorer is unique to itself. Therefore, the commands that you learn inside the CLI are critical because they will not change. Those are the same within all those. You still have your capabilities of being able to force what they call, instead of kill, force quit and screen share. You have features within the actual Mac OS, which is the multiple desktops, just like in the actual new features inside the Windows 10. You have what they call the mission control keychain spotlight, which is completely different than the spotlight that we spoke about in Windows. You have your iCloud, your gestures, your Finder, your remote disk, dock, boot camp are just a few of the ones that we will be mentioning within this session. As we said, we must be familiar with these basic Linux commands to be able to be successful and obviously be able to support these given systems. I believe, Mir, I pass it on to our friend.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So let's get started with the big pie. That's right, the big pie. Who here wants to notice something that is quite shocking here? Who is the dominant person here when it comes to operating share market? Oh, we
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Well, yeah, Bill Gates. Diego, we got a screen of your mountain instead. Oh, there you go. Okay. So yes, look at that. We got Windows 10. We got Windows 7. Let's skip Mac for now. We got Windows 8, XP. Oh my gosh, look at that. Look at that. And then you got Apple. And then after Apple, we finally get to Linux. Just a heads up, this is a little typo or a mistake on the graph. It's supposed to be 8.0, the original Windows 8. So let me just mark that off. There you go. The Windows 8. And a lot of people don't like it. I would agree on that. Same thing with Vista. No one really likes that. So we're not even talk about it. But notice that Linux is only 2% of the market share. Yet we have to learn it. Interesting. Very, very interesting. And we're going to be talking about why Linux is something that's very important to learn because in the corporate world that Diego was mentioning is very useful for servers, very useful for even multitasking. Linux is designed to do something that Windows cannot do. It's known as a multiple use operating system. And what it really is telling you is that more than one user can use Linux at the same time. You can have 3, 5, 6, 20, depends on how you design that Linux to operate. Windows, as we found out, can only have one user at a time on a system. That is the big, big reason why corporates love Linux. It's free, very powerful, very robust. You can have multiple users on the same possible computer. Imagine just one supercomputer able to do almost everything if you know how to operate it. And that is the big what's it called? Achilles heel? I believe Achilles heels of Linux. You got to know how it works. And that's why those who work in the Linux administration realm get paid so much money. It's not that easy to work with. But luckily for the CompTIA, as Diego mentioned, we only need to know the basics of it. Just basically very simple commands, basically general idea how it works, and that it's free. Very key word there, it's free. Even though it's free, it has about 2% of the market. In the internet of the world, about 60 to 70% of your internet runs Linux. So 2% runs about 60 to 70% of your internet. Very impressive. And then, of course, we got Mac, which we'll be talking about Mac shortly as well. I like Mac as well. It's an easy device to give to someone who just wants a computer to work from the start. Though there are some Achilles with Mac as well. And just like we mentioned about in T session 38 about Windows. So let's get started and move to the next slide. So now the growth and popularity for both Linux and Mac OS have increased the importance of computer tech. Like with any OS, these two will function better and remain more reliable with the proper maintenance. The following slides contain the common features and functionality of the macOS and the Linux operating system. Lists in the following topics: best practice, tools, feature, and I want to highlight this, basic Linux commands. Very interesting. We got a dedicated part for basic Linux commands, not Mac, Linux. So we're going to get into heavy details about that in the coming slides. So right here is a great example of a Linux. This is a Ubuntu, to be more exact. And a very big tip, this is most likely what they're going to refer to on the exam. On the exam, they like using the commands that are related to this distro. And for those who know a little bit more Linux, it's based on the Debian flavor. In other words, there are going to be certain commands that I will get in detail that they expect you to know that is related to this distro. But in general, on the exam, they just want you to know that if you see any of these names, Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Red Hat, Mint, these things are basically flavors of Linux. And you don't have to be overwhelmed with all the listing here. For the real exam, just knowing Ubuntu will be suffice for what you want to do. And if you want to learn different distros and have a good little mix, and it's up to you, I would recommend CentOS OS that's down here. Play with these two Linuxes and you're going to do just fine in, well, the world of Linux. These are the two most common ones you're going to see actually in today's market. But for the purpose of the exam, if you can only pick one, Ubuntu will be the one for the real exam. I guess I like Ubuntu a lot. Well, let's get to the next one. Now, this is how Mac likes versioning their versions of their OS. Believe it or not, I believe OS operating system is free. There's just one problem. It must work with Apple hardware. So yeah, the operating system, technically speaking, is free to download and use, but it has to be verified by Apple that they're using their hardware. That's a weird thing about Mac. You could, technically speaking, download it if you are a technician that is designed to fix these machines. And for those who like YouTube and what is his name? Josh, One More Family. It's a guy from New York. He talks a lot about Apple products. He gives a lot of good information. And basically what they're trying to tell you here is that these versions of the OS are free to download for the users. As long as they have a valid Apple product, meaning the hardware they're using is genuine Apple products, they can keep downloading these updates. And there's a trend here. They go with the species of cats. We got cheetah, pluma, and eventually they kind of like gave up here after lion. I guess they ran out of animals, and then they just start talking about mountains. We got mountain lion. Oh, that's a great start. And then they completely give up on the animal, trying to just talk about mountains. The whole purpose of this slide is to show that there is a history of the operating system being updated. You don't really pay for this, but you do pay for the hardware. That's a key point to know here in the real field, though. Okay, let's get to the next slide. Now, we're going to start talking about basic maintenances for both these other operating systems, Mac and Linux. I'm going to go based on these orders: schedule backup, schedule disk maintenance, system updates and apps, patch management, driver firmware updates, and anti-malware updates as well. So we got here on the left side about Linux OS, and then on the right side, we have the Mac OS. Chris, can you please tell us what's going on the Linux side? What can we do here to help with schedule backup?
Scheduled backups. Linux OS backup data can be scheduled using the rsync utility from the command line, can operate locally and remotely while encrypting the transfer. As with any command line utility, you can create batch files and schedule these backups. The tar and CPIO command line utilities are also used to construct full or partial backups.
Very, very good. Now, Mohammed, can you help me with the Mac OS side? Oh, do you hear me, Mohammed?
I thought you tell somebody else. Sorry,
Oh,
what did you say?
no. Need you. I need your help. So for
Okay.
Mac OS, help me out.
Mac OS breaking up data can be scheduled using the recent unit utility as well, but the time Mac machine utility breaks up the entire Mac must be enabled first, then it can automatically perform backups every hour, daily and weekly.
Oh, sorry guys, we just, oh, there we go, came back. Sorry about that.
That's right. This utility requires booting to all different drive to perform an operations on the drive and drive in equations.
Very good. So as we noticed, there's some things that are kind of similar here. When it comes to backup, it is possible for us to use this command. Look at that, resync. We can use that command on both these systems because they share common command lines. But there's one thing that is different completely when it comes to comparing to these. Who here knows what's the big difference from Mac and Linux that they're trying to say here? What is one feature that Linux does not have from the start that OS has? I'll give a little tip, it's in bold.
It's like the automatic backups have to be enabled. Is that what you're talking about? Or the time machine for full backups?
Yes, Time Machine. Time Machine is amazing. Linux has their own version too, but unfortunately it's a third party and it's more cumbersome to use as well depending on the distro. That's one thing I love about macOS. And on the exam, they do talk about this a lot because it is a great dash amazing feature from Apple. And it's also very important to know that you have to enable it sometimes as well. They keep changing it with Apple, I believe, Kelly, because I know you have a Mac system. Do you still have to enable it, the backup for hourly and daily with OS? Sorry,
Yes.
yeah, with OS.
Yeah, you do have to enable it. It is not done automatically, and it's a good feature to have, but it's also good to schedule it, like especially if you're doing with like mine. I have the 10 terabyte hard drives and stuff like that. I don't have all that stuff hooked up at any given time, so I have to schedule it to do it at specific times.
Very good. So we're gonna go back to this after ice cream time. Ice cream Chuck is here. I'll see you guys in the next 5 minutes. Very good job, guys.
So Kelly, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, sir.
Hey, I know you guys told me the other day I had to partition my drives before I format them to put the operating system. It's because what I wanted to do, what I was thinking about doing, like reading this stuff so that I can understand this better, or at least have something to play with, is to partition my drive after the fact, because I have like 350 gigabytes free, right? Is there some kind of third-party app or something that would allow me to do that?
There should be a partition manager within, you're operating off of a Windows system, I imagine? Or a Mac?
Yeah, I have Windows 10.
Okay. There is a
Disk
partition
manager,
manager
right?
within it that you should be able to set up new partition. Yeah, there you go.
Disk management is one of the labs that you got to do, and you'll be able to partition and or section off certain parts of the drive, shrink it, make it bigger.
So after the fact, I can still do it.
Nowadays, yes.
I know the older
The
systems
new
you could.
operating systems
Yeah,
only,
before,
not the old ones.
Oh,
You might
okay.
remember
put 'em in
Partition
there.
Magic. You remember Partition Magic at all, Joseph? Using that
Yeah,
one? Well,
yeah,
that is
I
what
know
the
that
new
one. I think,
operating system does.
okay. And that was a free download, Partition Magic?
No, that costed money that I'm aware of.
this
But
page is over
obviously,
there.
the OS already does it.
Oh,
So we're back. By the way, one on YouTube. His name is Louis Rosman. He is very popular for repairing Macs. So if you want to know more about Macs, especially repairing them, he is your man. At least I would recommend him for that specific thing. But like I said, for the exam, you're not going to be repairing Macs. You're going to be maintaining them in the most basic level here. Before we go to the next one, who here knows what tar is? This is something that will come up on the exam. Oh, I got a few hands up. There you go. You don't count. Well, Chris, you seem the most confident here. Tell me, what is tar?
Tar is like a zip file. It's a compressed group of folders and files.
Correct. So, Diego's going to show us, I believe, an example. Oh, nope, never mind. So, as you can see, tar is usually the command you use on Linux if you want to compress files. And this is very important because when you're using the resync utility on the command line to basically make a backup, that backup is most likely going to use tar. You can decide what you're going to use for which compression. But by default, all Linuxes use tar. All of them. So that's very important to know. So if you see the word tar, think of compressed file, save file, backup. So on the exam, be aware of that word. All right, very, very good. Let's get to the next one now, actually. Let's move forward. Now, we're going to be talking about the file systems now when it comes to Linux OS and Mac OS. On the left, we have over here ext3 and ext4. Most commonly in the Linux world, you will now see ext3, and then the more newer flavors or more updated and mainstream distros for Linux will use ext4. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because in the corporate world, a lot of times all these servers may be using older file systems, so that's why they expect you to know too. You never know if you get an older version of Linux that they decide not to update. Yet it's secure because there are side patches that keep it secure. Because there's the life cycle of that specific kernel. That's how they call it in Linux, or the kernel that they are still supporting. That's why we have to know these different versions. Unfortunately, because depending on what file system you're using, it's going to tell you the limitations of it as well. And luckily for this exam, you do not need to know ext2, but you do need to know about ext3 and ext4 and understand that if you see a system with ext3, that means they're using an older version, most likely, of the kernel. Because with Linux, there are many versions of the kernel. And luckily, we're not going to get into heavy detail about that. All you need to know is you can pick the kernel. In other words, you can pick a different version of the same OS, just in a backwards compatibility version, if that makes any weird sense. Because the life cycle of these kernels tend to keep getting updated, but you don't have to use the latest kernel. You can use an older one because sometimes when a new feature comes in or a new application comes in, sometimes it doesn't work with the latest kernel, so they use the one before it. Now, as you can see here, and Diego likes making a lot of fun with this one, this command over here. Now, in Windows, we said it was SFC, System File Checker. Over here, they call it SFC. FSCK, very close to a bad word. That's how I remember it too. And I had to thank Diego for that one. It is not a curse word, please. I want to make sure that's clear. But this is the command they use to check their system file system here. Now, it is very similar, of course, to the Mac OS file system, but we need to understand they are different. The history behind Mac and Linux can be summed up like this. Mac OS uses Unix. Unix is basically the granddaddy here. And then Linux came around saying, hey, you know that code from Unix? I'm going to modify it heavily. And now that's Linux was born. Because of that, they share a lot of similarities. But we need to know some things here. The Apple file system does not require defragmentation. That's something we're going to keep a note about. And checking the file system using the disk utility verify system disk, meaning Apple has their own version for you to check the health of your system's files. Mac likes to have this basically typed down. Only they are allowed to mess with your system. It's locked down, and that's a key term I want to use. It's locked down. Linux, you can do whatever you want. Apple, they don't like people playing around with it. It does it for you automatically. And the same thing over here with defrag. You don't need a defrag because Apple does it for you automatically. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Apple doesn't like the user doing anything. It does it for you. Linux, you got to do it. Now, little keynote here. It is true that these operating systems don't really require defragging at all. They work so well that they don't require it. Same thing for Linux though. Up-to-date versions of the EXTs do not require defragmenting. As the Eagle like to make a joke. I don't know why Windows can't do it, but apparently Mac and Linux can do that without any issue. Hopefully Windows can catch up. Let's get to the next good question here. All right.
They have been discussing changing their kernel to a Linux-based one. So,
oh, sorry. Say it again, Dave. I couldn't hear you.
I said Microsoft has been talking about changing Windows to a Linux-based kernel. So who knows?
Oh, that's news to me. I mean, that's not a bad idea. Though we have to wait to see because, well, we don't know until we see the results of their labor, I guess. Just hope it's not another Vista. All right, let's talk about here now system updates and app stores. Now, the Linux OS, it can be either in a traditional command line or through a GUI. And these are the two common ones over here they're talking about on the slide. Ubuntu and Fedora. Can never say the word right. Fedora? Yeah, it's Fedora. That's how you pronounce it, Fedora. Luckily for the exam, I doubt you're gonna be getting questions about Fedora, but you will get a lot of questions about Ubuntu, so keep a note about that. And what they're trying to tell you here is that most Linux are gonna be run in the command line because the GUI is just bloatware in most corporate worlds. In the corporate world, why do I need a GUI interface if I can just use a command line that's technically speaking faster if you know how to use it? It is usually faster than the GUI. I save money and all my things if I don't have a GUI. I save space on my drive. I save RAM and computing power. I don't have to compute all of this. Just a command line saying, do this. Good job. Done. So that's something very important to know and the reason why it's so heavily used in the corporate world. And then, of course, through these update tools, it is possible to check if any updates are available and then upgrade if needed, known as a package manager, something that I wish Windows was a little bit better with. But Mac also has their own version of a packet manager. Guess, I want someone to guess what that is. It's in this slide. What is Apple's version of a packet manager, technically speaking? Pray to anybody. It's on the slide and it's in bold.
Apple Store.
Yes, believe it or not, that is a packet manager. Why? That's where you can download, update, basically almost everything on a Mac. Same thing with iTunes. It's basically their version of a packet manager. And that's really what a packet manager is. It's just a centralized area for you to do updates, download things. It's amazing and it's very useful. Windows is trying to do the same thing with their Windows Store, not doing so well with that as a lot of people are aware of. But that is what a packet manager is. It's just a place that is centralizing and making it easier for you to basically update and download things that you want, including updates to your operating system. And that's a key term here to remember. Use usually a packet manager, like an app store, in this case for Apple, and then for OS, known as a packet manager, that allows you to update these things. And here are the commands that you see here. Sudo, which we'll talk about in a future slide, what that does. But we have here a command that tells us to get updates. Same thing over here. We got updates over here going on. Very good. Over here with the App Store, you just go to the App Store, it does it for you. Like I said, it's all locked down. Apple does not like people playing around with their system. It does it for you. Linux, you can do what you want. Your system. Now we're getting to the big difference now. So when it comes to patch management, they kind of use similar features here. So let's talk about it. Use the same tool to manage patches as Windows, System Centers, Configuration Manager, correct. Patch management. So what is Linux's version? Oh, we just mentioned it. It's basically the package manager. And it's actually a command line that you put. Over here, we have various versions. You can actually update, known as, I guess over here, they're trying to say something. Let me see here. Yep. Very common thing here to know. The packet manager here they're talking about here is Ubuntu. And then for Red Hat, which you don't need to know for the exam because they don't really use Red Hat on the exam, this is their version of the packet manager. They're named differently, but just remember that basically what they're trying to tell you here is that this packet manager is related to Ubuntu, and this packet manager is related to Red Hat. And over here, they're trying to tell you can update your software in this centralized packet manager that I was referring to. Now, on the Apple side over here with the firmware and driver updates, unfortunately, it's locked down, as I mentioned. Either you go to the website or you go to the App Store that does it for you. Now, they're talking about drivers and firmware updates. This is the problem with Apple. You have to go to the website if you're going to do anything that requires changing your system's hard drive, because Apple owns it. You say you buy the system, but unfortunately Apple locks it down. You need to go to the support site. You're going to most likely have a technician do it for you. So that's one downside of Apple. You can hope that on the Apple Store or on iTunes, when you get a update on your operating system, it has these firmwares in it. Kelly, you're there? Because I know you use Apple a lot. What do you do to update your drivers usually? You have to go on the App Store to do that? Okay. We'll go back to that question later. But basically, just a short run of this. They're trying to tell you that this is the packet manager that Ubuntu uses. And this over here is what Red Hat uses. And for the exam, just be aware that the personal package archive is what they're going to be referring to as what you are having in your system to update your system, including firmware. And then for Apple, you're usually going to struggle to update anything with Apple. They're going to ask you to go to the website, and sometimes you have to go to the Apple Store to even update your computer in some cases.
No, Apple Store is main site place that you can do stuff with Apple products. I'm unaware of it allowing you to do from unknown sources.
Yeah, they have it locked down really badly to the point where if you want to update something, sometimes you have to go to the App Store. That happened to me with my iPad too. I couldn't update it because it was an older one. I had to go to the store to get the update, and they had to change the battery. So it depends on Apple, I guess. But I will go with go to the website and see what they tell you to do, because that's basically what they're asking you here if you want to update something on your computer. It's very, very locked down. Apple loves its walled garden. Yep. Yep, that is true. Let's get into the next page. Luckily in the exam, I'm not going to get too heavy detail about this, but for the real world, we just know that they have their own versions of managing their patches. Now, for the longest time, Linux and Mac OS didn't have too many issues with malware. They did exist, but it wasn't that heavily used because, as we noticed with the market share, what is the majority of the market share for OS? Anybody here has a guess?
The first two spots were Windows.
Oh, yeah. I'll say that
Well, yeah, more than that. I mean, there's
they own like about, what, 80% of the market or more?
something like that. So if you're going to spend a lot of time working on malware or viruses, you're going to go for the biggest chunk of market share you can get versus attacking a smaller competitor.
So when they say for a very long time, Mac users never had to worry about viruses, I don't like this word never. I like to use the word most likely. Was because, well, a lot of hackers and those who want to do bad things, it wasn't worth it to them. But as we notice in the slide, Mac and Linux is becoming more prevalent, is increasing. Therefore, now hackers are saying, hey, I can make money with these. One very famous one is jailbreaking, which we're going to come up on that slide way later on in our class. But jailbreaking is a very classic one that we can think of basically messing with Apple's software. Don't do it. You want to play around with it, make sure it's an old thing, and we're going to talk about that in the far future. But that's basically what they're talking about here, is that back then, people didn't worry about viruses for these other operating systems. Now you should. And just like Windows, you may want to purchase something that can help you do that. Anti-malware. So let's talk a little bit more of that in the next slide. So
May I
over
ask a
here,
question
yes.
about jailbreaking?
What's your question?
So the jailbreaking is actually you willingly break your device to use that particular application. Is that right?
Basically,
not without your willing.
Yeah, because the whole thing about jailbreaking is that, technically speaking, with the term and condition with Apple, you are now allowed to be the root user, which we'll talk about what root means. It means that you are the administrator, you're the head. Apple does not want to give that permission to anybody. The terms and condition is clear. If you break how it does its authentication, meaning how it's telling if it's legitly Apple and it has not been compromised, meaning you don't have access to change its code, that's basically what jailbreaking does. It voids that. It breaks it, saying, no, I'm the
You
boss.
become
I do
root.
whatever I want. But the problem
Yeah,
is,
you
Apple don't
basically
like it.
become root.
And Diego, have you jailbreak before a phone? I think you have, right?
Yes.
Yes.
I did
there's
actually
not-
on my Apple TV.
You could do it to the Apple TV too, correct? Obviously, what it does is you become root, and now you can install from unknown sources, because now you do not have to abide to the Apple Store. You become the administrator.
Well, wouldn't there be a downside to that if Apple found out? And
You no longer have warranty. Your warranty is void at that point.
And sometimes
Your
they'll kick
warranty
you
is
out on the App
completely
Store
void.
too. So if they find out it's jailbreak and they see it, they will do whatever they can to deactivate your Apple ID. So if you're jailbreaking, I recommend you remove your Apple ID on that device. You don't want any reason for them to suspend it.
There are common misconceptions, but now most of the jailbreaking tools completely remove any trace, so you can take it and the warranty won't be voided because you put it back to factory default
If you
setting.
put it back to factory default before you take it to them, correct. But if they know that you did it, they will void it.
I will be careful, because if you jailbreak it and you break it, there's not much you can do there. So that's the risk. So if it worked, that's good. And if something bad happens to it, like Diego and Jose just said, try to find a way to get it back to factory mode if possible, and then give it to them. Keep the warranty at least.
Well, if you're beyond the warranty, just have fun.
All right, let's go back to macOS versus Linux here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how you can maintenance, and if things go bad, what you can do to fix them, basically. I'm going to go a little bit quick here, because we want to get to Linux commands, but that's where the big bulk of your test question is going to be here. So, backup and then time machine, Linux OS. So when it comes to Linux like using commands. By default, most Linuxes are going to have these commands over here: append, cardiac, create. These are basically to make something called an archive. An archive is uncompressed, by the way, of things that you want to combine. So let's say I want to archive a whole bunch of documents, a whole bunch of Word documents, got like 100. I'm going to archive it, meaning I'm going to basically combine them. They're not compressed yet. What would I use to compress that? We'll mention it here in these last slides before. What would I use? Starts with T. I'll give it a tip.
The tar
That
command.
tar command, right?
Correct. And tarball is the full name that they use on Linux for actually compressing it. But you don't need to know that for exam. But you do need to know that when you're archiving it, you're basically combining all the data. And if you want to compress it, you use tar to make it more manageable as well. And here are all the commands you can use. On the exam, I'm pretty sure they're not going to give you these type of commands. They are known as long worded commands. You see these two little dashes here? That means long written. You actually have to write them down like this. There is no short words or anything. And for options, you got to be very careful. If you're first learning Linux, I would recommend using long because it makes sense. It actually tells you what it does. When you get to commands, you can notice they're much shorter and they usually don't have these two dashes. They have one. Depends on how the command works. That's the thing about Linux. All the commands are different. This is the common scheme, but not every command does that common scheme though. I'm going to detail about that later. Let's get to the next part of this nice flag here. So now this is Mac's version of backing up. You click this button and you're pretty much done. Time machine. Love it. I see Kelly laughing, but yeah, it's true. You just click on it, make sure it's on, you're done. And if you want to make sure it's backed up, because remember, it's not enabled by default, you have to schedule the backup. That's the only thing you need to know about Mac OS. Make it pretty easy, love it. All right, so now we're going to talk about how to restore things. So we're going to talk about how to restore with Linux. Now, with Linux, depending on how you have your distro, most likely you're going to hopefully have made a snapshot, meaning you have a image of how it was, and to restore it, you need to use this command over here. There are many different commands, but this is the most common command you're going to use to go back to that point of a snapshot. And over here, it tells you how to create that snapshot. So first, you need to do the S argument, meaning you write this down, then you put the option known as S, and then it's going to make a snapshot. Keep that snapshot on an external device. If the system goes bad and you can't access that snapshot, well, you're out of luck. Once, let's say something bad happens to the Linux system and it's asking for a restore point, in other words, a snapshot, that is when you will insert your USB. You have the file there. You use the command to search for it, and then you load it from that snapshot. You don't need to know the full detail about it, just need the high level, meaning you just need to know that's what you're going to use if you get to that scenario. It's more complicated to actually do it than what I said. Now, luckily, Mac OS makes it very easy for us. Mac OS, what do? Time machine, that's it. Really, there's not much we can go through. You just go to time machine. You enter on the time machine when you want to do it. You can navigate the files and everything. You can locate. Pretty much all you got to do, really, the hard part here is you got to locate the file that time machine is saving it and pick the one you want. And you're pretty much done there. Time machine does everything. There's nothing that you really need to edit with time machine. And as I mentioned, Mac has things locked down. You can't change too much. So you start time machine, you enter the time machine, you look and navigate where the file was that you're saving it. And then from there, you locate the file, click restore button, and it restores it for you. Pretty nice. Have you used time machine before, Kelly?
Yeah, I've used it before. I do more manual backups nowadays, but I have used it in the past.
Oh, so you don't like time machine too much. No, in the corporate
Well, I mean, if I was dealing with much small, if I was dealing with much smaller file systems, yeah, I would use it on a more regular basis. But it's a pain with what I'm dealing with currently.
Time machine is good. In the corporate world, you're going to be using time machine a lot if it's a problem with your Mac system. It's there it's there. Why not use it? It does everything for you basically for restoring. Ooh, what do we got here? Oh, just a glitch. All right. Now, image recovery. Both systems can recover an image using the same technique as restoring a single file. Below are the methods for recovering the whole image. Notice something interesting here. The command. Recovery of the image can be done using the resync utility to restore the entire snapshot. Interesting. Recovery for Mac now is done through the disk utility along with a backup of the system and the OS medium. They're both using a snapshot. They're both using a utility, believe it or not, that uses a very similar command. This is a GUI interface that is using this command over here. with the many options that you have for resync. Apple makes it easy. You just have a GUI that says, hey, please fix it for me. Click it. It has its own smarts to try its best to restore based on the snapshot that you gave it. For Linux, if you're using the default Linux, meaning you don't have a third party to restore the snapshot, you will manually have to set the right functions, the right arguments, the right pathway meaning the right directory of the file in order to get it working correctly. Much more work, but they both work the same in the hood, the underhood. Very important thing to know that for the exam. So now let's get to the next part. Here we go. Lots of tools and functions here we're going to talk about. So the Unity performed disk-related tasks on Mac OS, including the creation, conversion, compression, and encryption of a disk. Both systems can recover an image using the same technique as restoring a single file. Below the method for recovering the whole disk. And as we mentioned here, we got a command here, resync. This is a command that backups and restore. Then you get time machine, and everything you see here, believe it or not, would work on Linux and Mac, except for Time Machine, because Time Machine, believe it or not, is a proprietary program from Apple. So that's very interesting. So these are tools that you would use. Very good to know. Now we're going to talk about the shell. Believe it or not, the terminal is the same name in Mac. That is on purpose. Who here has an idea why they're using this basically the same name convention?
They're both based on Unix, and that's what it was called.
Exactly, and that's why some of the commands that we're talking about, I mean, plenty of these commands. Look at this. Almost all of these, except for Time Machine, are valid commands on Mac and Linux. So that's why a lot of the commands that we're learning here, and even the terminal, use the same terminology. Not everything though, but majority of it. So that's why they use the same name. So whenever you get on the exam terminal, they could be talking about Linux or Mac. Majority of the time, it will be Linux though on the exam when they use the word terminal. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And with a terminal, what does that let me talk to? What does the terminal let me talk to if we're talking about it as a shell? Any bets here?
Kernel.
Exactly. We get to talk to the kernel. Now for the exam, they're not going to talk too much about what kind of language a terminal is using, but just a heads up in the real world, if you hear the word bash, most likely it's going to be Linux. That's what Linux uses for their language of the shell. Apple has their own proprietary, basically language for the terminal. I don't remember what it is, but a lot of the commands that you use, believe it or not, in today's Apple will work with bash, because I believe they have an interpreter for bash commands. Same thing with Windows, believe it or not. PowerShell has the ability to use some of the bash language commands, which we're going to show that in the fourth feature and exam when we have to do security. So it's very interesting for us to know that a lot of terminology
is Z shell, and I think it's very similar to bash.
Correct, because of Unix, they still have the terminology. A lot of the things that Linux uses is going to be Unix based when it comes to, well, the lower level, because that's where it was basically born. It was just Unix is unique. I love it. It's old, but it's being updated constantly from Apple. And then when it comes to Linux, Linux is just a heavily modified version of, well, Unix, very heavily modified, but they still use a lot of the same conventions. It makes only sense. If you have already a plan for, there's no real reason to deviate. The only time it ever deviates is for special scenarios. So let's get into more detail next slide about, well, screen sharing. Now, don't panic when you see all of this, because on the exam, a lot of this is not important except for one thing: how you screen share. To screen share on Linux, you use VNC, Virtual Network Connection. This is an old way of doing things for screen sharing. And that's why it says here it can be done through a third party. or following the procedures as a root user, meaning if you want to do the old way of remote desktoping basically, or sharing your screen, you need to go through this long list of commands that we're going to explain to you in the next future slides, where you have to change a permission, you need to go to this directory, then you have to go to your SSH as a root user, then you have to write the right commands, then you have to change the mode of your kernel to make sure it can support from single user to now multi-use, meaning what level of the kernel you're using, which is level 3 if I remember right. And then after all of that, you still need to go to the user screen and then make sure you have the correct users. And then after that, you finally can now screen share without using a third-party tool. On the exam, you're not going to be expected to do that. But for the real world, for those who ever have the unfortunate side of logging into a server and unfortunately you need to log into that server, you're going to need to use SSH. And if you're really, really unfortunate, where you have to use whatever proprietary program they're using to remote to that system and you can't use SSH, you have to use some sharing product. This is how you would do it. On the exam, they're literally going to tell you what can you do to remote access a Linux machine that does not involve SSH is going to be VNC. We'll write that down because it is a third-party app that a lot of people use, and I did see that on my exam. No need to know all of this, but we will talk about this command chmod in the next slides coming up. So don't get too overwhelmed with that. Now with OS, it's actually built in. So luckily, all you have to do is enable share screen and you're able to share your screen. And over here, this is what I'm talking about, virtual networking connection. This is what Linux uses, but you have to download it. Apple already has it. It's very similar. That's basically what they're talking about over here. This thing here, please don't panic about it. Not required for the exam. Only in the real world if you need to really learn all this. It's very sophisticated. But over here, this is all you need to know. Virtual network computing, VNC. This bad boy gets everything done. Very good. And important note, Mac has it already built in. It's already included. Linux, you need to download it. Get to the next one. Oh, it's not updating. Oh, there we go. Now we're going to talk about ways to, well, use Task Manager basically. Windows has a Task Manager. We use it to kill things. Over here, we have different ways to do it. Now, the command here is, well, kill. That is Mac's version. And over here, for Mac OS, you use a GUI, where you use a program right over here to basically end it, force quit. That is the difference. Now, with Linux, you need to be careful. And the reason why is because you need to tell it what you need to kill, because this is a command line. You need to find its PID. Basically, this is the process ID. What process ID from the CPU is it using right now? Over here, we got a process here. Oh, let me change the color so you can see it. There we go. So over here, we have the PID, the process ID. So if I want to kill this, I need to first spell kill, then the PID, and it will do it. Be warned, it will end it immediately. It does not ask for any feedback. No warning. It will do it. Apple will probably give you a little warning when you use the GUI, but Linux will not, because it assumes you are the boss. You tell it to kill it, I'm gonna kill it, boss. If you tell it to kill itself, it will literally kill itself with no warning. So very powerful tool. Be very, very careful with the command kill on Linux. Mac is going to be a little bit more forgiving, but if you use it on their terminal, it will do the very same thing as administrator. So if you're an administrator, you go there to their version of the terminal and use that command, it will do the same thing with no warning. So be very, very careful of that command. Very careful. Now, we're going to talk about some features with the Mac OS. Mac has something called the multiple desk mission control. In other words, if you have one screen and you just want to get to another workstation, as we call it in Linux, because Linux has something very similar to it, called workspace, you're able to just switch a monitor to a different monitor, same monitor, but a saved workstation of other features. So let's say this window that you see me right now is workstation 1. If I move it to workstation 2 and I have a browser up watching a funny cat video, I can just do that by clicking a few buttons. I can click the mission control, click the switch, and it changes the whole monitor screen as if I'm using a different monitor. It's very useful for those who only have 1 or 2 monitors. I wish I can show you a live example of it. It's kind of hard to show a real example, but it's very useful.
Isn't that like Microsoft's new desktop switching?
Exactly. And that was, I think in Windows 10, they implement that. It works. It's pretty good. Same thing, believe it or not. Same thing. And now, as Diego mentioned, we got to be careful about this word, spotlight. Spotlight is used to search for things in the Mac OS. It is not Windows version of a fancy little picture when you try to log in. So remember that. That's a word they like to trick you on the exam. Are they talking about Microsoft's version of Spotlight, or are they talking about the Mac's version of Spotlight? And of course, we have iCloud. Very powerful, very useful. You can use it for many, many things. Then you have gestures, if it's touch paddle, or if you can touch it, depends on the screen. And then you have Finder that helps you find documents. Kind of similar to Spotlight, but there's kind of minor uses. Then you have Remote Desktop, Dock, Boot Camp. Boot Camp is very interesting. We're going to talk about that in the future. That macOS has, and these are features. I want to keep a note about. Oh yeah, there goes. Thank you, Diego. Yeah, these are features. So if you get any of these questions on the exam, this is what they're talking about. These features. You only find these features on the Mac OS, not on Windows, not on Linux, Mac. They may have something similar to it, like Windows. Oh, sorry, what was that?
To kind of distinguish, nothing, just kind of distinguish between Spotlight and Finder. Spotlight is just basically, it is a search function where you know, it's like a little magnifying glass where you click on it, type in what you're looking for, and then it brings down a couple things. Finder is kind of like Windows Explorer, where you're literally going in and looking through each of the files like a browser.
All right, thank you for that clarification. I may be a Linux lover, but unfortunately, I don't use a lot of Apple products, so I wouldn't know that unless I use it heavily. So thank you for that clarification, Kelly. So that is the difference. This is more like Windows Explorer. This is more searching. You just click a button, click little words there, search for it. That is what he's referring to over here. Very good. Thank you, Kelly. Let's get to the next one quickly. Now we're going to get to the commands. And I'm going to highlight the commands that you should definitely know for the exam. All of them I recommend, but if you're going to save time, this is my recommendation. All of this, I recommend you learn to use because it will be on the exam. All of it. Why? Because CD is change directory. Who knows what that means? I believe we played a little bit of this with Windows. They use the same command, actually, believe it or not. What is this?
Basically, you're moving into a different file folder.
Correct, David. That is exactly the point. And as funny it is, they use the same command. Believe it or not, Windows command prompt use the same as Linux when it comes to CD. But this is completely different. Change mod. This changes the permissions on the folder. And in Linux, it's represented with numbers 7, 5, 3, 2. Luckily, you don't need to know that for exam. That is what the numbers you saw on the previous few slides. We saw 755. That's telling me 7 meaning root has all control. 55 meaning read and execute. I know that by heart because I love it, but on the real exam, they don't ask you questions like that. All you need to know is that change mod lets me change the permissions of a folder or file. Just like in Windows, when you right click it and you want to edit the permissions to read or write or execute. Same concept, but you use a command called change mod, and then you put the numbers that if you want to know by heart, like 7, 6, 5, that's just how you would do it. Now, change mod is a little bit different. And the little key term here is if you see CH, think of change, own as owner. That's how I know the difference from these two. Change mode, change owner. And the reason why it's important because this command can change the ownership of the file. Just like in Windows, you can have groups. And with those groups, you can have permission saying, hey, you own this file. If you own the file, you have the right to do whatever you want basically on it. With Linux, a little more complicated, but that's basically what they're trying to tell you here with this command. With that command, you're able to change the ownership. Let's say you want to give the ownership to somebody else, no problem. Change mod, hey, this user now owns this file. That's theirs, not mine, theirs. That's the whole purpose of chmod. Sorry, chmon. That sounds similar to me. And CP, very similar to Windows. Same thing with ls, directory, listing the directories are very similar. Same thing with make directory. This is how you make directories right here. And MV is very unique. MV does double duty here. MV allows us to rename a file and move the file from one directory to another. So if you want to change the name of a document, you have to use MV. It's a little bit weird if you think about it, but it makes sense in computer language though. Unfortunately, I don't know how to explain it in heavy detail, but basically, if you want to change the name, you have to use MV. And if you want to move it, you need to use MV as well. This right here is super dangerous, extremely dangerous. RM, remove, delete files. If you use this command with the option F, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because if you do that, it will delete with no warning. And it will delete it. So if you decide to do RM delete system and you have the option F on it, it will delete it with no warning and goodbye system. On the exam, you just need to know what this RM does, but it's very powerful in the Linux world. And it's very easy to remove viruses with this command too. If you know where the virus is and you use command force, it's going to delete it. 9 out of 10. There's always an exploit going on, but that's basically what it does. And now this one over here, keep a note about it because there's a lot of test questions about it. PWD displays the current directory. In other words, it's telling you where you are in the directory because remember, you're looking at a command line. It's no GUI. It doesn't tell you exactly where you are unless it's in text format. So let's say you're, playing around with your command line. You're kind of lost where you are. What directory am I in right now? In my pictures? Am I in my downloads? If I put PWD, it will tell me and it will print it and display to me where you are. Path word directory is how I remember this one. And the reason why I'm going in detail with that is because in the next slide, there's a command that's very similar to it, but it does a completely different thing. Let's see. Oh, it's not on this slide. Let me see. Let me get to that slide quickly. And then I go backwards. There we go. This command right here. It's very similar to PWD. It does not mean password. It does not. This is how you change the password. So in the exam, they like to trick you a lot with the option of PWD and then passwd. Remember,
And
if they ask,
password.
yes, pass and then word. And then if we go back to the other one, look at the difference. It's just 3 letters. They tend to trick you with that. So this is not password. It's print work directory. That is its name. Print work directory. And like Diego mentioned, pass and then word. That is how you change your password. Very important we know that because they like tricking you a lot on the exam on that question alone. So keep a note about that. Now over here, with the next Linux commands we got going on here, we should be changing back. Here we go. A lot of the commands, luckily, you don't need to know too much in detail. All you need to know is a high level. The other ones over here, I recommend you play with in the Linux when we do virtual machine. You should play with them. Over here, you don't need to play with these commands too much, but you should know what they do, especially this one here, because this is a big feature with Linux called grep. So DDD allows you to basically make copy blocks from one file to another. In other words, what they're really trying to tell you is, how can I copy data from a different storage drive, like a flash drive? That is what DD is used for. In order for me to copy from one drive that's been mounted to copy to a different mounted drive. That's what they use in the lingual for Linux called mounting. Now, get app is very important, and this is the command that you're going to get on your exam when they're trying to tell you, hey, I want to download something. How'd you download it? Get. When you see the word get, remember download. That's what they're referring to get. You're getting the download from a repository site. That is your packet manager, your personal archive for Ubuntu. That's where you're going to be getting a lot of your packet manager files here. PS is just your processing. Just like we showed here in a few slides before. Oh, too fast. Over here, this is the command you use. And look right there, it's PS, right over there. So it shows you your basically list of what's being processed, what resources are being used. That's how I would know what to kill if I have to kill something. That's what we're talking about here. Shutdown is just like Windows, you just shut it down. And then VI is how you edit things just like a notepad. It is more difficult to use, but it works. And now we can get to the last few here that unfortunately in the exam, they're going to try to trick you here. These two do a very similar job, but they do things differently. And on the exam, they want you to know their definitions. So let's read these definitions. Su, start a new shell as another user. Keyword, another user. The other users is assumed to be root when the command is invoked without any arguments. What they're trying to tell you here is that if you were to put Su and you don't put any username, by default, meaning, hey, you're not telling me what user is, I'm going to assume it's root. That's just how the function works. So it assumes you go to root. Root is the administrator, the all almighty power for that system. And the very important to know for the exam, starts a new window, new shell as another user. If they ever tell you anything on the exam to switch to user, this is the command you're going to use. But if they ask you in the exam, if you want to do something once as another user, that is when sudo comes in. And a lot of people use Linux, even the high tops and best Linux users will use sudo because being root is very dangerous. Very dangerous to always be on root. So let's read about sudo. Allows you to run a command as another user, lose the root user, but it does once. Terminology we use here is super user do once. That's a terminology a lot of people use, meaning you're going to do as this user, as another user once. Super user do once is a good analogy to remember. And that is the difference from su. Su is super user. A lot of people use that analogy. And then super user do once is an analogy a lot of other people use to know the difference. But in the exam, if they give you a question and they ask you to do something once as a different user, sudo. If they ask you to keep being logged in, it will be su. And unfortunately on the exam, they will like to trick you with these terminologies. So know these terminologies pretty well, and you'll be doing pretty good when it comes to the commands for Linux. All right, let's get to the last part of the command sheet here, because we're going to go out to lunch here. This is basically what I was mentioning before about, well, changing the permission. This is child mod. Basically, when you see here, add, remove, others, these are basically read, write, execute. They tried to make it easier. This is 4, this is 2, and this is 1 when it comes to the numbering convention they use when it comes to grouping chmod. Nowadays, you can just put read, write, and then X to do that. But if you're going to be using Linux, you're going to be using numbers instead. And it's very important to know here that these are separate. You got the who's, we got the user, group, and then others. There is actually a group called others in Linux. And then you have one called all, meaning everybody. And then over here is trying to tell you what action you can do as well. You can add, remove, or assign. And over here, you got permission. You can read, write, and execute. So luckily, it's very, very similar to how Windows does it if you use this terminology. Very similar. All right. I believe we're almost done here, though. Let's finish this and go to break. All right. This first one over here. Which of the following application stores are compatible with the iOS? Who wants to help me with this? What are we going to put here?
Is it Apple Store?
Apple Store.
I mean, App Store. App Store.
Oh, App Store. Ah, okay. Everybody agree? Ah, I see good faces here. Let's move to the next one. Click, click, click. Okay, not going. Oh,
No, I don't know why it won't let me click next.
that's weird. Try again. I just refreshed it.
Oh, I know what it is. Maybe I have to hit this next. No.
That's
All right.
weird. It should be working. Oh, I think it's glitched.
Yeah. It's
Let's
stuck
just-
for me. It won't. Go ahead and go. I guess let's continue. Sorry.
Just continue. All right. What do I do to? Do I share it now? If we're stuck there?
Mine was working.
Now
Oh,
it goes. Finally.
Oh,
Like an
sorry
hour
about
later.
that, guys.
Go ahead.
All right, let's get the next one. In a Linux operating system environment, what command will display the current directory to the user?
The PWD.
Ah, okay, okay.
What does that stand for again?
Print
Oh.
working directory.
Sorry, say that again.
Print working directory.
Thank you.
Good question. Very good. Let's get to the next one. All right. What is the name of the area at the bottom of a Mac OS X screen where, by default, a car of crucial icons appear?
A foot. Oh wait.
Foot. Okay, let's put foot. And when someone says foot, it got to be true. Anybody else have any?
Dock, yeah.
Dock.
It's the dock.
Doc. Okay, I have a lot of people saying Doc, so I guess we stay with Doc. Yes.
I like my foot answer, bro. Fine.
You do. All right. Which Linux command can be used to let you run a single command as another user?
Sudo.
Sudo. What's the analogy that you use for sudo?
Super user do once, what you said.
Correct. In the Linux world, we love saying that word. Super user do once. You're gonna hear a lot when you start learning more about Linux on your own if you wish to do that. So very good.
And some people, or at least the terminology supposedly is also switch user, but everybody loves super user. Because as he
Correct.
stated, root is by default if you don't put anything.
And unfortunately, because that terminology that the Linux community used makes this exam harder, because Diego's right. Switch user is what it's supposed to stand for. Switch user do once, switch user. That's its real definition. But we call it like that because, like Diego mentioned, we're assuming you're trying to get to root. All right, let's put sudo. And then let's get the last one. We got one more, and then we can finally go on break. All right. We got one more to go. Which Linux utility can be used to check and repair disk?
So the FSC.
FS.
FSCK?
So makes me want to say something else.
I know. You got to be careful how you say it. I practice a lot to make sure I don't say it wrong.
It's file system checker, so that's basically what it's supposedly for.
Woo-hoo. We got it all right. Good job, everybody. I highly recommend, like I said, the first line of command for Linux. You learn that, and then the rest, know the high level learning of them. If you want to save time and be efficient in your studies. And I do mean it. All right. I guess it's break time now.
Before we break off, please note, obviously there is some test out labs associated with this for this week. And pretty much at this point, we should be able to explain the purpose and the context of knowing how to navigate the OSs, including Mac OS and Linux and mobile OSs themselves, and compare the contrast of features with functionalities of these. Do we have any questions in reference to this session before we conclude? Thank you. I'll see you guys in a